The lion cub stood 10 feet from Daniel Harper, its amber eyes holding a terrible knowledge that made his blood run cold. Not the wild fear of prey meeting predator, but something far more unsettling: intelligence, desperation, and unmistakable purpose. In 40 years of engineering bridges and buildings, Daniel had learned to recognize structural failure. This creature was failing. Ribs pressed against golden fur like cathedral arches, a ring of scarred flesh circled its neck where no collar should have been, and its legs trembled with each labored breath. Yet it didn't flee, didn't attack. The cub took 3 deliberate steps toward the ravine, stopped, and looked back. Those ancient eyes held Daniel's gaze with surgical precision. Another 3 steps, another look, an invitation written in the language of survival itself. Daniel's hand found his phone, no signal. His truck sat a mile behind him. Every instinct screamed run. Instead, he followed. He thought he was saving a dying cub. He never imagined the cub was actually saving him. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. Daniel Harper had spent the last 3 years learning the language of solitude. At 68, the retired structural engineer from Portland, Maine, had become fluent in the silence that filled his renovated farmhouse near Spain's Sierra Morena Reserve. It was a silence he'd chosen after burying his son Michael 5 years ago. And his wife Margaret 2 years later. She'd simply stopped fighting after their boy died, her heart giving out from a grief too heavy to carry. The construction accident that took Michael had been mundane in its cruelty. A cable snapped, 3 seconds of falling. 28 years of life ended on wet concrete. Daniel had designed 100 buildings to prevent such failures, yet couldn't save his own son. The irony had driven him across an ocean, seeking anonymity in the Spanish countryside where his failure as a father couldn't follow. His farmhouse sat on 40 acres bordering private conservation land, a pocket of wilderness where Mediterranean forest gave way to limestone ridges and hidden ravines. The region had a complicated history. Ancient smuggling routes now served wildlife traffickers, while legitimate conservation efforts struggled against local farmers who'd grazed these hills for generations. Recent droughts had pushed both animals and tensions closer to breaking points. Daniel knew some of his neighbors by necessity rather than choice. Dr. Elena Rodriguez ran the Regional Wildlife Rehabilitation Center with a fierce dedication that reminded him painfully of Michael's passion for animals. James Mitchell, another American expat living 2 miles north, had retired from the State Department under circumstances he never discussed. Carlos Mendoza, the local conservation officer, treated all foreigners with professional skepticism, viewing them as either naive idealists or potential problems. Sarah Bennett had arrived 6 months ago, a wildlife photographer documenting what she claimed was an extensive trafficking network. Father Thomas O'Brien, the Irish priest who served the small international community, had tried repeatedly to draw Daniel into local life, but Daniel preferred his isolation. Before Spain, before the grief. Daniel and Michael had volunteered at wildlife centers during Michael's teenage years. His son had dreamed of African conservation work, had spent a college summer with a lion research project in Morocco. Those memories felt like artifacts from another man's life, now carefully preserved but too painful to examine. Daniel had come to Spain to disappear. He'd built his walls carefully, engineering a life where nothing could touch him again. He hadn't counted on a dying lion cub knowing how to find the cracks. Daniel's morning routine had become a meditation on purposelessness. Every day at 6 o'clock, he walked the fence line separating his property from the reserve, checking for damage from wild boar or loose cattle. It was unnecessary work. The fence meant nothing to the animals who crossed it at will, but it gave shape to emptiness. This Tuesday morning in late September started like all the others, with mist pooling in the valleys and the first light turning the limestone cliffs the color of old bones. Then the birds stopped singing. In 3 years of walking these hills, Daniel had never heard such complete silence. Not the pause between songs, but an absolute cessation, as if the forest itself held its breath. He stopped beside a cork oak, his hand instinctively moving to the walking stick that doubled as a defensive weapon. The mist shifted, parted, and through it came a shape that didn't belong. Golden fur materialized from the gray dawn like a fever dream. A lion cub, perhaps 6 months old, stood in the middle of the trail. Daniel's mind struggled to process the impossibility no wild lions had existed in Europe for millennia. This had to be escaped from somewhere, or dumped, or... The cub's condition stopped his speculation cold. Its ribs formed a grotesque architecture beneath patchy fur. Open sores wept where something had rubbed its neck raw, not random injuries, but a perfect circle. The unmistakable mark of a collar worn too long and too tight. Its breathing came in shallow gasps, and its legs trembled with the effort of standing. Yet its eyes remained fixed on Daniel with an intensity that transcended animal instinct. There was calculation in that gaze, evaluation, decision. The cub wasn't lost or wandering. It had come here deliberately. Daniel's hand fumbled for his phone. No signal. The dead zone that made his property so appealingly isolated now trapped him with an impossible decision. The truck sat a mile back at the house. The wildlife center was 40 minutes away. He could run, probably should run, but something in the cub's stillness held him. It didn't crouch to spring, didn't bare its teeth. Instead, it turned with agonizing slowness and walked 3 steps down the trail toward the ravine. Stopped. Looked back over its shoulder with those terrible, knowing eyes. 3 more steps. Another look. The invitation couldn't have been clearer if it had been written in words. Every rational thought screamed against following a predator into unknown terrain. But Daniel recognized something in the cub's movement, in the way it kept checking to ensure he followed the same desperate patience he'd seen in emergency rooms, in people waiting for news that would shatter or save them. This creature needed something, and somehow had decided Daniel could provide it. He followed. The cub led him off the familiar trail into terrain he'd avoided in 3 years of residence. Here the forest grew denser, older, untouched by the casual hiking that marked the reserve boundaries. Cut fence wires hung like injuries in the morning light. Fresh tire tracks pressed into soft earth where no vehicle should have been. Boot prints overlapped in patterns that suggested hurry, perhaps panic. 20 minutes in, they reached a makeshift camp recently abandoned, judging by the still smoldering fire ring. Empty cages built from welded rebar and chicken wire stood stacked beside a tarp shelter. The ground was littered with the detritus of cruelty chains, medical supplies, feeding bowls marked with dried blood, a professional operation, hastily evacuated. The cub moved faster now, its urgency overcoming exhaustion. Daniel followed through thorns that tore his shirt, over rocks that threatened his 68-year-old knees. His breath came harder, reminding him of age and foolishness. But the cub's desperate purpose pulled him forward. Michael would have followed without hesitation. The thought came unbidden, unwelcome. His son had possessed an almost mystical connection with animals, a trust that transcended species. Daniel had always been the cautious one, the engineer calculating load limits and failure points. Yet here he was, following a dying predator into the Spanish wilderness because something in its eyes reminded him of his son's faith in the possibility of understanding between species. The ravine appeared suddenly, a gash in the landscape hidden by clever geography and morning shadows. The cub descended via a barely visible path, looking back constantly to ensure Daniel followed. At the bottom, where water should have run but drought had stolen, lay the reason for everything. The cub had brought him to its mother. The lioness lay on her side against the ravine wall, positioned with deliberate care despite her obvious agony. Even in her extremity, she had chosen a defensive position, back protected by rock, body curved to shield something Daniel couldn't yet see. Her breathing came in irregular gasps that lifted her ribs like broken bellows. Foam tinged with blood collected at the corners of her mouth. This was no trap injury. Daniel recognized the symptoms from the ranch dogs his neighbors had lost to illegal poisoning: the rigid muscles, the dilated pupils, the way her body fought against itself. Someone had baited meat with pesticide, probably carbofuran, the poison of choice for those who killed predators with cowardly efficiency. The lioness had eaten it, likely desperate with hunger, and now died slowly while her cub watched. The young lion rushed to its mother, pressing its head against her shoulder, making soft chirping sounds Daniel hadn't known lions could produce. The mother's eye, the one Daniel could see, tracked her cub's movement, but her body remained paralyzed by advancing toxins. The cub pushed harder, trying to lift its mother's massive head, chirping with increasing desperation. When that failed, it began licking her face with mechanical persistence, as if grooming could reverse death. Daniel's knees hit the rocky ground before he realized he'd fallen. The scene fractured through sudden tears, overlaying with another time, another place Michael on construction site concrete. Daniel pressing his son's chest, breathing into lungs that wouldn't respond, begging a body to return to life through sheer paternal will. The same helpless repetition, the same desperate denial of obvious truth. "I couldn't save him," Daniel heard himself say to the dying lioness. "I designed buildings to protect people, and I couldn't protect my own son." 3 seconds. A cable snapped and he fell for 3 seconds and everything ended. The lioness's eye found his, held it with diminishing strength but undiminished awareness. Predator and man regarded each other across species and circumstance, finding commonality in the universal language of parental grief. Her breathing stuttered, stopped for terrifying seconds, then resumed weaker than before. The cub abandoned its futile grooming to approach Daniel, stopping just out of reach. Its eyes held a question as clear as spoken words. "Can you help?" Daniel forced himself to think past emotion, to become the engineer who solved problems. The lioness needed immediate medical intervention, but moving her could trigger fatal seizures. He had no antidote, no IV fluids, no way. To his fingers found something unexpected in the lioness's ear, a small electronic tag, professionally attached. Not a trafficker's crude marking, but official conservation equipment. Daniel leaned closer, reading the miniature print, "Property of Atlas Lion Recovery Project Morocco. If found, contact." The number that followed was international. His hands shook as he retrieved his wallet, pulling out the laminated card he'd carried for 5 years, Michael's volunteer identification from his college summer in Morocco. The same logo, the same project. Daniel stared at the impossible connection, his rational mind insisting on coincidence while his heart recognized something larger at work. The lioness convulsed, a violent spasm that sent the cub skittering backward. Daniel knew that pattern. The poison was winning, systematic shutdown accelerating. Without immediate intervention, she had minutes, not hours. He thought of the tire tracks at the abandoned camp, the cut fences, the professional cages. This wasn't random poaching. Someone had targeted a tagged, protected lioness from an international conservation program. They'd poisoned her to collect her cubs for the black market. But something had gone wrong. Perhaps authorities had gotten too close. Perhaps the cub had escaped during capture. Perhaps the speculation could wait. Daniel pulled out his emergency flare, the one safety precaution he'd maintained even in his self-imposed isolation. The red fire shot skyward, a wound in the morning sky that would bring attention whether he wanted it or not. Then he ran. 3 years of solitary walking had kept him fitter than most 68-year-olds, but the return journey tested every reserve. He crashed through underbrush, leaving skin on thorns, dignity on rocks. His phone found signal halfway back 1 bar, enough for a desperate call to the only number he'd programmed, the wildlife center. "Elena Rodriguez," the voice answered in accented English. "There's a dying lioness in Ravine Santiago." Daniel gasped. "Poisoned. Has a cub. She's tagged from Morocco's Atlas project." Silence. Then, "Lioness, sir. There are no lions. She's dying now. GPS coordinates." Daniel rattled off the numbers he'd memorized from years of surveying his isolation. "Bring antidote for carbofuran poisoning. Bring everything." He hung up and kept running, reaching his truck in a personal record he'd pay for later in aching joints. The vehicle protested the brutal pace over rough tracks, but Daniel had built his life around machines that performed under pressure. 15 minutes back to the ravine, James Mitchell's Land Rover was already there. The former diplomat standing beside it with a military-issue medical kit. "Saw your flare," he said simply. "Figured it was serious. You're not the type for false alarms." They descended together, James moving with the easy efficiency of someone trained for crisis. The scene they found had worsened. The lioness's breathing had gone shallow and erratic. The cub pressed against its mother's belly, and only then did Daniel see what the lioness had been protecting. She was pregnant. Heavily so. The swelling obvious now that her protective curl had relaxed. Jesus Christ, James breathed. She's carrying. His hands were already moving, pulling supplies from his kit-activated charcoal, atropine, supplies Daniel recognized from military field medicine. Can't wait for the vets. We start now or lose them all. Daniel held the lioness's head while James worked, feeling the weight of another species' trust. The cub watched from inches away, no longer chirping, as if understanding the gravity of human intervention. Time stretched like it had in the construction site, each second containing hours of possibility and dread. Elena Rodriguez arrived with controlled chaos, 3 vehicles, a portable surgery unit, 2 assistants. She took in the scene with professional assessment that shifted to shocked recognition. This is Sophia. She's one of ours, from the Atlas Project. She was released 2 years ago into protected land 300 kilometers from here. How did she? Questions later. James interrupted. She's crashing. The next hour blurred into desperate efficiency. IV lines, injections, oxygen mask modified for feline anatomy. The cub had to be physically restrained from interfering, Daniel holding the young lion with gentle firmness while it fought to reach its mother. He found himself whispering Michael's words, phrases his son had used with frightened animals. Easy now. We're helping. She knows we're helping. The sun climbed toward noon, burning off the mist that had shrouded the morning's impossibilities. The lioness Sophia stabilized enough for transport. As they prepared the improvised stretcher, Elena discovered something that changed everything. Daniel, she said, holding a tablet showing the lioness's digital records. The original rescuer of this lioness. The volunteer who found her as an orphaned cub in 2019. She turned the screen toward him. The name hit him like a physical blow. Michael Harper, Portland, Oregon. A photograph showed his son, young and radiantly alive, holding a tiny lion cub that would grow to become Sophia. The circle closed with devastating perfection. His son had saved her. Now she lay dying, and her cub had somehow found its way to Michael's father. Daniel's legs gave out for the second time that morning, but this time James caught him, steadied him. The cub approached, no longer maintaining safe distance, and placed one paw on Daniel's knee. The gesture was so deliberately comforting, so impossibly knowing, that Daniel broke completely. He sobbed into his hands while somewhere his son's rescued lioness fought for life, while his son's legacy stood on 4 trembling legs beside him, while the universe revealed its impossible architecture of connection and consequence. The morning that began with silence ended with sirens and shouts and the controlled chaos of emergency veterinary intervention. But at its center remained a fundamental truth. Michael's work had not ended with his death. It had just found its way home. The logistics of transporting a dying lioness and her traumatized cub would have challenged a zoo with unlimited resources. Elena's Wildlife Center operated on donations and government grants that barely covered local species. Moving 2 African lions, one critically poisoned and pregnant, the other young and defensively aggressive, required innovation born of desperation. They converted a horse trailer, welding reinforced gates between compartments. James Mitchell provided military-grade sedatives from sources he didn't explain. Carlos Mendoza, the conservation officer who'd arrived with questions that quickly became secondary to crisis, used his authority to clear roads and silence objections. The procession that wound down from the ravine looked like a refugee evacuation. 3 trucks, a trailer, and Elena's mobile surgery unit bouncing over tracks never meant for such traffic. Sophia crashed twice during transport. The first time, Elena managed to stabilize her with injections that made Daniel think of emergency rooms, of watching doctors fight for Michael while he stood helplessly aside. The second time required full CPR, Elena's small hands pumping the lioness's massive chest while her assistant drove and Daniel held the barely sedated cub from lunging toward its mother. She's pregnant, Elena said what they all knew but hadn't voiced. At least 7 months. If she dies, we lose the cubs too. If we do emergency cesarean now, the cubs die anyway too premature. The cub, Daniel, had started thinking of it as male, though he wasn't certain made sounds that transcended species. Not quite roars, not quite cries, but something that spoke directly to mammalian instinct. Daniel found himself humming, the same tuneless comfort sound he'd used with Michael during childhood nightmares. The cub's struggles lessened, though its amber eyes never left its mother's still form. The Wildlife Center sprawled across converted farmland 40 minutes from Daniel's property, a collection of concrete buildings, chain-link enclosures, and the constant sound of distressed animals. Elena's staff had cleared the quarantine facility, a separate building with medical equipment that looked salvaged from human hospitals. They transferred Sophia to a surgical table reinforced for large animals, while the cub was placed in an adjacent cage where it could see, but not interfere. The next 48 hours blurred into medical crisis management. Sophia's blood work showed massive organ stress from the carbofuran, complicated by pregnancy toxemia. Her body was failing in multiple ways, each system's collapse triggering others. Elena worked with grim efficiency, consulting specialists in South Africa and Morocco via video calls that stretched through nights. "The cubs," she announced after one such consultation, "are moving, still alive. But if Sophia's blood pressure drops any lower, the placenta will separate." Daniel hadn't left the center except to retrieve basic supplies from his house. He slept on a cot Elena's staff provided, waking to the sound of the young cub's distress. The third night, he found the cub lying flat against the cage bars, reaching one paw toward its unconscious mother, making that heartbreaking chirping sound. "Your mother named him Michael," Daniel said, not caring who might overhear him talking to a lion. "My son. She named him after the prophet Michael, the warrior angel. She said he'd need strength in this world." He sat on the concrete floor, his back against the cage. "His middle name was Courage. She let me choose that one. Seemed pretentious at the time, but he grew into it." The cub withdrew its paw, turned, and fixed those ancient eyes on Daniel. Slowly, with the deliberation that marked all its actions, it moved closer to where Daniel sat, not quite touching, but close enough that Daniel could feel its warmth through the bars. "Courage," Daniel said. "That's what you are. Isn't it walking miles while starving to find help for your mother? Leading a strange predator because that's what humans are to her. That's courage." The newly named Courage made a different sound, softer, almost questioning. Daniel reached through the bars, his hand stopping inches from the cub's muzzle. Letting the animal decide, Courage sniffed, then pressed his head against Daniel's palm. The contact lasted only seconds before the cub retreated, but something fundamental had shifted. Elena found them that way at dawn. Daniel asleep against the cage with Courage curled as close as bars allowed. She said nothing, but Daniel caught her wiping her eyes as she checked Sophia's monitors. The breakthrough came on day 4. Sophia's eyes opened, unfocused but aware. Courage immediately sensed the change, his chirping taking on a different quality, joy mixed with residual fear. Elena allowed Daniel to open the connecting gate under strict supervision. Courage approached his mother with careful steps, sniffing her wounds, then lying pressed against her side with a sigh that sounded utterly human. "She's not clear yet," Elena warned. "The pregnancy is consuming resources her body needs to clear the poison. We might still have to choose." But word had already spread through the small community. Sarah Bennett, the wildlife photographer, had been documenting everything with Elena's permission. Her images, carefully edited to avoid identifying the location, had gone viral online. Poisoned Atlas lioness fights for life in unborn cubs in Spain generated donations that crashed the Wildlife Center's website. Not everyone celebrated. At the Tuesday market, Daniel faced unexpected hostility. "Millions of euros for African lions while Spanish shepherds lose sheep to wolves," an old farmer spat. "You Americans come here with your money and your projects, changing everything." Father Thomas O'Brien intervened before the confrontation escalated. "Would you prefer the traffickers' profit instead?" the priest asked mildly. "These lions didn't choose to be here. They're victims, too." The community divided sharply. The tourism board saw opportunity international attention could revive the struggling local economy. Conservationists demanded immediate release to proper facilities. Traditional farmers worried about predators so close to livestock. The mayor called emergency meetings that devolved into shouting matches. Daniel found himself at the center of controversy he'd spent 3 years avoiding. Reporters appeared at his gate. His phone, silent for so long, rang constantly with interview requests he didn't answer. James Mitchell appointed himself unofficial security, his Land Rover parked strategically to block unwanted visitors. "You've made enemies," James said one evening, sharing coffee while watching sunset from the wildlife center. "That abandoned camp you found, someone invested serious money in that operation. They won't appreciate the attention." The threat materialized 3 days later. Daniel returned from the center to find his fence cut, his door forced, and a message spray-painted on his wall: "Stop or join your son." The cruelty of it, using Michael's death as a weapon, transformed grief into rage. Daniel had built his isolation from sorrow. But fury was architecture of a different kind. He called Carlos Mendoza, officially reporting what he'd suspected since finding Sophia. "This wasn't random poaching," he said. "Someone knew exactly where she was, what she was worth. The Atlas project tags are supposed to be confidential." Carlos, who'd initially dismissed Daniel as another meddling foreigner, had revised his opinion after witnessing the rescue. "I've been investigating," he admitted. "The tire tracks match vehicles registered to a reserve administrator. Someone inside has been selling location data." The investigation accelerated when Sarah Bennett provided photographs she'd taken over 6 months' vehicles at strange hours, meetings between reserve officials and known traffickers, equipment that didn't match official inventories. Her documentation, combined with the evidence from the abandoned camp, painted a picture of systematic betrayal. "They target pregnant females," Sarah explained, her laptop displaying graphs of disappearances. "Cubs are worth more than adults, and newborns can be sold as captive bred with fake documentation." The revelation sickened Daniel, but it also explained Courage's desperation. The traffickers had likely tried to capture him after poisoning Sophia, but something had gone wrong. Perhaps authorities had gotten close. Perhaps Courage had escaped during the confusion. Either way, the young lion had made a choice that defied what Daniel thought he knew about animal behavior, seeking help from humans after humans had destroyed his world. Michael's journal arrived via international courier on day 10, sent by a colleague who'd been cleaning out archived research materials. Daniel hadn't known it existed. His son had documented his time with the Atlas project in meticulous detail, including his first encounter with an orphaned cub. "Found her by her mother's body," Michael had written. "Poachers had taken everything valuable and left them to rot. She was maybe 2 weeks old, trying to nurse from a corpse. When I picked her up, she was so light I thought she was already dead. But she opened her eyes and looked at me with this expression I can't describe, like she was deciding whether to trust the universe one more time. I named her Sophia. It means pure in Arabic. Despite everything, she was pure potential." Daniel read by Sophia's cage, Courage listening as if understanding every word. Michael had written about hand-feeding Sophia, about her first successful hunt, about the day she was released to the wild with a GPS tag and dreams of species recovery. "Dad would say I'm too emotionally invested," one entry read. He'd calculate the odds of success, the resource allocation, the cost-benefit analysis, but some things can't be engineered. Sometimes you just have to believe that one saved life matters, that it ripples outward in ways we can't calculate. Maybe someday he'll understand that my work isn't about rejecting his worldview, it's about building something he never thought to calculate hope. Daniel closed the journal, unable to continue. Sophia's eyes were open, watching him. Courage had moved closer to his mother, but maintained that strange awareness of Daniel's emotional state. The three of them sat in shared silence while Elena's staff worked around them, and the Spanish sun marked another day of survival. On day 14, Sophia stood. It lasted only seconds before her legs buckled. But she stood. Courage circled her, making sounds Daniel now recognized as encouragement. When she tried again an hour later, she managed 3 steps. The third attempt, she reached the water bowl and drank on her own. "The pregnancy is actually helping now," Elena explained. barely containing excitement. Her body's protecting the cubs, accelerating healing to ensure their survival. I've never seen anything like it. But the victory was temporary. Ultrasound revealed a problem: 3 cubs, but one had stopped moving. The stress had been too much. Sophia's body would have to reabsorb the failed pregnancy while maintaining the others. The process could trigger premature labor, infection, or complete miscarriage. Daniel watched Elena deliver this news to a lioness who couldn't understand words, but seemed to comprehend catastrophe. Sophia's eyes held the same recognition he'd seen in the mirror after Michael's death, the knowledge that something essential had broken and might never fully heal. That night, Daniel broke his own rules. He entered Sophia's enclosure. Elena found him sitting beside the lioness. Courage pressed against his other side, all 3 breathing in synchronized rhythm. She should have called security, should have enforced protocol. Instead, she brought a chair and sat outside the cage, keeping watch while man and lions grieved together for losses that transcended species. "Your son," Elena said quietly, "would be proud." Daniel nodded, unable to speak. Sophia's massive paw rested against his leg, claws retracted. "Wait careful." Courage had placed his head on Daniel's knee. They stayed that way until dawn, a tableau of impossible trust born from shared sorrow. The next morning brought 2 developments. First, Carlos Mendoza arrested 3 reserve officials and a veterinary technician who'd been selling animal locations to traffickers. Second, Sophia went into premature labor. The emergency cesarean that followed tested every resource the Wildlife Center possessed. Elena operated with assistance via satellite link from specialists worldwide. Daniel and James held Courage in the observation room, the young lion alternating between window and door, seeking his mother through glass and steel. 2 cubs survived, both female, both tiny, both fighting with the same fierce determination that had brought Courage to Daniel's fence line. The third, a male, had died weeks before. They buried him beneath an olive tree while Sophia recovered from surgery. Courage watching from the window, as if understanding the ritual of farewell. Spain's environmental minister arrived unannounced the following day, trailing media and making promises. The publicity had become politically useful, a success story of conservation triumph over trafficking. Funding materialized for the Wildlife Center. Experts arrived from Morocco to assist with the lion's care. The story went global, generating millions in donations and thousands of adoption offers that Elena systematically rejected. "They're not pets," she repeated to every reporter. "They're Atlas lions, critically endangered. When they're ready, they return to protected land." But ready seemed impossibly distant. Sophia remained weak, her cubs fragile. Courage had latched onto Daniel with an attachment that concerned the experts. A wild animal shouldn't bond with humans this way. Yet without Daniel's presence, the young lion refused food, paced obsessively, and made sounds that haunted the staff. Father O'Brien visited on a Sunday, bringing communion wine that he and Daniel drank like medicine. "You know what this is, don't you?" the priest said, watching Daniel hand-feed Courage through the fence. "Redemption. Not the pretty kind from sermons, but the messy kind that comes from showing up when you'd rather disappear." "I couldn't save my son," Daniel said. "No, but your son's work is saving them, through you. That's not coincidence. Daniel, that's grace." The investigation, meanwhile, had expanded internationally. The trafficking ring reached into multiple countries, moving everything from lion cubs to exotic birds. Sarah Bennett's documentation proved crucial, her 6 months of patient observation providing evidence that prosecutors called unprecedented in wildlife crime. One name kept surfacing in interrogations: Vincent Kruger, a South African dealer who specialized in ethically sourced exotic animals for private collections. He'd ordered Sophia specifically, knowing her Atlas genetics made her cubs worth fortunes. The poison had been his backup plan when capture failed. James Mitchell made some phone calls, his State Department connections, it turned out, remained active. Kruger's been on watch lists for years, he told Daniel. But he's smart, stays just inside legal boundaries. This time he made a mistake, Spanish soil, EU jurisdiction, clear evidence trail. They're building a case. The threat against Daniel escalated. Dead animals appeared on his property, a clear message. His truck tires were slashed. Someone burned the olive tree where they'd buried Sophia's lost cub, leaving the charred trunk like a monument to cruelty. You should leave, Elena urged. Take a vacation until this calms down. But Daniel couldn't leave Courage, who'd begun refusing food whenever Daniel missed a visit. The bond had become biological, measurable in stress hormones and vital signs. Breaking it might kill them both. So Daniel moved into the wildlife center temporarily, sleeping in the staff quarters, spending days with the lions while lawyers and law enforcement built cases and the world watched through Sarah Bennett's lens. He read Michael's entire journal to Courage and Sophia, sharing his son's words about hope and conservation, about believing in recovery against impossible odds. The cubs grew stronger, opening eyes that held their mother's wisdom and their brother's courage. Daniel watched Sophia teach them to nurse, to crawl, to exist. She remained weak but determined, her body prioritizing her offspring over her own recovery. One morning, Courage did something unprecedented. He carried one of his sisters gently, perfectly, as adult lions transport cubs to where Daniel sat outside the cage. He set her down facing the human, then sat beside her, clearly presenting his family for Daniel's approval. Elena captured it on video, the moment when a wild lion chose to share his most precious trust with a grieving father who'd lost everything. The image circled the globe within hours, becoming iconic. Man and lion, separated by necessity, but united by something deeper than blood or species. 3 weeks after the rescue, Vincent Kruger was arrested in Morocco, trying to acquire more Atlas lions. The warrant from Spain, reinforced by international wildlife treaties, ended his decades of trafficking. His arrest revealed the full scope: hundreds of animals, millions in profit. A network that reached into governments and conservation organizations, meant to protect the very creatures they sold. Daniel testified via video link, holding Courage's favorite toy, a rubber ball Michael had once used for dog training. Discovered in a box Daniel hadn't opened in 5 years. He spoke about finding Sophia, about recognizing his son's work, about the strange paths grief takes toward healing. They say animals don't understand human emotion, he concluded. But Courage found me in my isolation and brought me back to life, just as my son once saved his mother. I don't call that coincidence. I call it completion. The center had to build new fencing to handle the crowds who came to glimpse the famous lions. Donations funded expansion, proper facilities, staff. The small Spanish town found itself on the conservation map, its economy revitalized by unexpected attention. But at the heart of it remained something simpler, an old man reading to lions in the evening light, his son's words bridging the space between species, while Courage listened with amber eyes that had seen too much, but still chose trust. The crisis arrived at 3 a.m, 6 weeks after the rescue. Daniel woke to Elena's urgent call. Sophia had gone into premature labor, her body finally overwhelmed by the cascading failures that poison, pregnancy, and trauma had triggered. He drove through darkness, breaking every speed limit, arriving to find the wildlife center transformed into an emergency theater. Sophia lay on her side, panting in distress that transcended physical pain. The contractions came wrong, too fast, too violent, her body trying to expel cubs that weren't ready for the world. Elena worked with desperate precision while her assistant maintained anesthesia levels that walked the knife's edge between pain management and respiratory failure. She's only 7 months, Elena said, not looking up from her work. The cubs need another month minimum, but her uterus is rupturing. If we don't do cesarean now, we lose everyone. Daniel found Courage in the adjacent cage, pacing with manic energy, his calls shifting from roars to whimpers. The young lion knew, somehow, across species and circumstance, he understood that his family balanced on the edge of extinction. We need to move her to surgery, Elena announced. But she's too unstable. Her blood pressure keeps crashing. Every time we try to lift her, she codes. The next hour became a battlefield where life and death grappled in real time. They converted the quarantine room into an operating theater, bringing surgical equipment to Sophia rather than moving her. Elena cut while her assistants monitored vitals that fluctuated wildly. Daniel held Courage back from the temporary barrier they'd erected, the young lion fighting with strength born of desperation to reach his mother. The first cub emerged limp and gray, its tiny body showing no response to Elena's revival efforts. She worked for 10 minutes that felt like hours before declaring what they all knew stillborn, probably dead for days. The second came out moving weakly, a female that Elena quickly intubated and passed to her assistant. The third, another female, emerged in distress but fighting. Then Sophia's heart stopped. The monitors screamed their electronic panic while Elena switched from obstetrics to cardiac resuscitation. She pumped Sophia's massive chest while shouting for medications that might restart a heart that had simply endured too much. Daniel watched the cubs' 2 tiny lives gasping in incubators while their mother died on the table where they'd been born. "Take them," Elena commanded without stopping compressions. Skin-to-skin contact, body heat, anything. They're going into shock. Daniel found himself holding 2 premature lion cubs against his chest, their combined weight less than a house cat, while their mother's heart refused to restart. Courage had gone silent, pressed against the barrier, his amber eyes fixed on Sophia's still form with an expression that looked entirely too human. 5 minutes of CPR. 10. 15. Elena's assistant quietly suggested stopping, but Elena continued with mechanical determination, sweat dripping onto Sophia's open surgical site. 20 minutes past the point of probable brain death, past hope, past reason. "Elena," Daniel said softly. "She's gone." "No." Elena's response came out harsh, desperate. "Not after everything. Not when we're this close." But even as she protested, her movement slowed. 25 minutes. The cubs against Daniel's chest were failing too, their breathing becoming irregular. He faced an impossible choice: stay with Sophia's body or try to save her cubs in the makeshift NICU they'd assembled next door. Then James Mitchell spoke from the doorway, where he'd been standing silent witness. "There's something else in her file. Elena, check her chip data again. The full record." Elena wanted to refuse, to keep fighting, but she stepped back from Sophia's body and pulled up the digital records on her tablet. What she found changed everything. "This can't be right," she whispered. Then louder. Sophia was patient 0 of the Atlas Project, the first successful rehabilitation, found as a 2-week-old cub in 2019 by... She turned the tablet toward Daniel. The screen showed a younger Michael Harper holding a tiny lion cub, his smile radiant with purpose. But there was more. Michael's field notes, archived in the chip's data cloud, included details that made Daniel's knees weak. Michael had named her Sophia after the Arabic word for pure, but also because it sounded like Sophia, Daniel's mother's name, Michael's grandmother who died when he was 12. He named her after Grandma. Daniel breathed, the cub still pressed against his chest. "He never told me." The revelation shattered something in Daniel, not painfully, but like ice breaking to reveal flowing water beneath. His son had carried family forward, even into his conservation work, weaving personal history into his professional passion. The lioness dying on this table wasn't just an animal Michael had saved. She was a living memorial to family, to continuity, to love that transcended species. Daniel approached Sophia's body, still carrying her cubs. He placed them against her chest, tiny forms against their mother's cooling fur. Then he did something that would have seemed insane 6 weeks ago. He lay his head against Sophia's shoulder and spoke. "He saved you because he couldn't save his grandmother from cancer. He told me once that watching her die made him understand that we're all temporary, that the only thing that matters is what we leave behind. You were what he left behind, Sophia. You and Courage and these cubs. His legacy isn't buildings that won't fall, it's lives that continue." Whether it was the warmth of her cubs against her chest, the sound of a grieving father's voice, or simply the mysterious resilience of mothers, Sophia's heart stuttered once on the monitor. Elena flew back to the table, injecting epinephrine directly into heart muscle. Another flutter. Another injection. A third, then weak but unmistakable rhythm. "She's back," Elena breathed. Jesus Christ. She's back. The next hours blurred into controlled chaos. Sophia remained critical, but stable, her body somehow finding reserves that shouldn't have existed. One cub, the second-born, didn't survive the night despite every effort. But the third, a female Daniel had been holding, grew stronger with each passing hour. Sarah Bennett arrived at dawn, her cameras capturing what would become one of the most shared images in conservation history. Courage, finally allowed into the recovery room, standing guard over his sedated mother while his surviving sister nursed weakly. Daniel sat beside them, his hand resting on Sophia's shoulder, reading from Michael's journal. The story exploded across international media. Lioness dies for 25 minutes during emergency C-section. Returns when cubs placed on her chest became the headline that launched 1,000 donations. But the deeper story, Michael Harper's connection, the generational link between conservation efforts, transformed public interest into public investment. By noon, Elena's small center had received pledges totaling €3 million. The Spanish government, facing public pressure, announced emergency protection status for the center and its residents. The European Union launched an investigation into wildlife trafficking that would eventually result in the largest prosecution in its history. Vincent Kruger, arrested in Morocco, faced additional charges when investigators found records showing he'd specifically targeted Sophia because of her genetic value. He'd known about Michael Harper, had researched the young conservationist's work, had possibly even arranged the accident that killed him, though this last suspicion would never be proven. Daniel discovered Michael's final letter 3 days later, hidden in the journal's back cover. His son had written it the night before his death, apparently planning to mail it, but never getting the chance. "Dad," it began, "I know you think my work is impractical, that I should focus on human problems before animal ones. But I need you to understand, saving wildlife isn't separate from saving ourselves. Every species we lose diminishes us. Every one we save elevates us. The lioness I told you about, Sophia, had her first cub last month. Watching her teach it to hunt, seeing that ancient knowledge pass between generations. I understood what you tried to teach me about structural integrity. Some things have to be preserved not because they're useful, but because they're foundational. Without them, everything collapses. I hope someday you can meet her. I think you'd understand each other, both engineers in your own way, both building things meant to last. I love you, Dad. Thank you for teaching me that the most important things are the ones that endure." Daniel read the letter to Sophia, who was conscious now, though still weak. Her eyes tracked his movement, and when he finished, she did something extraordinary. She reached out with one massive paw and placed it gently on his arm. The gesture lasted only seconds, but Father O'Brien, who witnessed it, would later swear he felt the presence of something sacred in that touch. Courage had transformed from desperate cub to protective brother, positioning himself between his sister and any perceived threat. When Elena needed to examine the tiny female, Courage would allow it only if Daniel was present, as if appointing the human as co-guardian. The behavioral experts called it unprecedented. Daniel called it family. The international response overwhelmed the small Spanish town. Journalists from 50 countries descended, booking every hotel room within 50 kilometers. The mayor, initially skeptical of the attention, now embraced it as economic salvation. Local restaurants created Lion's Pride menus. Children drew pictures of Courage that decorated shop windows. The story had become myth, and myths generate their own momentum. But in the eye of that storm sat an odd quiet, an old man reading to lions. A young cub teaching his sister to walk, a mother recovering against all odds. The circus spun around them, but at the center remained something simpler and more profound, the recognition that love transcends species, that loss can become purpose, that sometimes the universe arranges impossible meetings to heal wounds we didn't know could heal. Elena released the surgical video with Daniel's permission the moment when Sophia's heart restarted after her cubs were placed on her chest. It was grainy, clinical, without sound except for the electronic beeping of monitors. Yet it became the most watched conservation video in history. Not for its drama, but for its proof of something people desperately wanted to believe, that connection matters more than category, that love is the only force that truly resurrects. The surviving cub grew daily, her eyes opening to reveal the same amber intensity as her brother's. Daniel named her Hope at Elena's suggestion, though privately he thought of her as Michael's grandcub, a genetic grandson his son would never meet, but had made possible through work that rippled forward in time. Carlos Mendoza's investigation had triggered a cascade of arrests. The trafficking ring collapsed, its members turning on each other for reduced sentences. The reserve administrators who'd sold Safia's location faced life imprisonment. The veterinary technician who'd provided the poison broke down during interrogation, revealing a network that reached into zoos, hunting ranches, and private collections worldwide. Your son may have saved more than just Safia, Carlos told Daniel. His documentation methods, the protocols he established, they're being used to protect dozens of reintroduction programs. He created a blueprint for conservation security that will outlive us all. The revelation that Daniel processed while sitting with the lions at sunset was this. Michael hadn't rejected his father's engineering mindset, he'd applied it to living systems. Where Daniel built bridges to last centuries, Michael had built genetic bridges to carry species across extinction's chasm. They were the same work, enacted in different mediums. On the morning that marked 2 months since the rescue, Safia stood unassisted for the first time since surgery. She walked 3 steps to where Hope lay sleeping, lowered her massive head, and began grooming her daughter with the infinite patience of mothers everywhere. Courage watched, then joined, the small family reforming around its wounds. Daniel watched through the fence, tears streaming unashamed down his weathered face. Behind him, Elena and her staff, James Mitchell, Father O'Brien, Sarah Bennett with her ever-present camera, all witnessed the moment when grief transformed finally and fully into grace. Safia looked up from her cubs, found Daniel's eyes, and held them with an expression that needed no translation. They had saved each other. That was the truth neither species could speak, but both understood. In the end, salvation was mutual, or it wasn't salvation at all. The injunction arrived on a Thursday morning in November, delivered by 3 government officials who stood at Elena's office like executioners. Daniel watched her read the document, her face draining of color as each paragraph revealed another bureaucratic betrayal. They're giving us 72 hours to transfer all 3 lions to the state facility in Madrid, she said, her voice hollow. The ministry claims we're not equipped for long-term care of endangered species, that Safia needs specialized treatment we can't provide. Daniel took the papers, scanning the legal language that masked political maneuvering. The real reason emerged in subsection 12. A private consortium had offered to purchase the lions for a conservation partnership that sounded suspiciously like the captive breeding programs that turned wild animals into commodities. They can't do this, James Mitchell said, reading over Daniel's shoulder. Safia's still recovering from surgery. Moving her now could kill her. That's the point, Elena said bitterly. If she dies in transport, they'll blame us for inadequate care. If she survives, they'll take credit for rescuing her from our incompetence. The news spread through the community within hours. Father O'Brien organized an emergency meeting at the church, where 200 people gathered to protest the decision. The mayor, who'd embraced the economic benefits of the lion's presence, promised to fight the order. Sarah Bennett published a scathing article that went viral within hours, triggering international condemnation. But bureaucracy moved with inexorable momentum. The transport vehicles arrived 2 days later, steel cages on trucks branded with the ministry's logo, operated by men who handled Safia and her cubs like cargo rather than miracles. Daniel tried to explain Safia's medical needs, Courage's behavioral requirements, Hope's feeding schedule. They nodded without listening, checking boxes on forms that reduced lives to inventory numbers. The stress triggered immediate deterioration in Safia's condition. Within hours of the transfer order, she stopped eating. Her surgical site, nearly healed, began showing signs of infection. She lay in the corner of her enclosure, eyes dull, while Hope cried for milk that wouldn't come. Elena worked through the night, adjusting medications and IV fluids. But Safia's body was shutting down from psychological trauma as much as physical stress. She'd survived poison, surgery, and the loss of 2 cubs only to face another separation. Another upheaval that her stressed system couldn't process. Hope developed a rattling cough that evening. The smallest cub, already fragile from premature birth, struggled to breathe in the November cold. Elena set up heat lamps and nebulizers, but the respiratory infection had taken hold with frightening speed. Every breath sounded like water in pipes, a sound Daniel recognized from Margaret's final days. The breaking point came at 3 in the morning. Daniel was sleeping in the staff quarters when his phone rang, not Elena calling from the medical building 50 yards away, but his own house alarm, 20 miles distant. He'd forgotten he even had the system, installed years ago and never used. Who would break into an isolated farmhouse that had stood empty for 2 months? He drove through darkness, expecting vandalism from those who opposed the lion rescue. Instead, he found his front door open and muddy paw prints leading from the threshold to the kitchen. There, drinking from the dog bowl that had belonged to a Springer Spaniel dead 5 years, was Courage. The young lion looked up at Daniel's arrival, water dripping from his muzzle, his eyes holding an expression of such deliberate intent that Daniel forgot to be afraid. Courage had escaped a professionally designed enclosure, traveled 20 miles through unfamiliar territory, and somehow found the house where Daniel's scent lingered strongest. This wasn't accident or animal wandering. This was a decision. "You came for help," Daniel said, understanding flooding through him. "Hope's dying, isn't she? And you came to get me?" Courage made that chirping sound, urgent and desperate, then walked to the door and looked back, the same gesture he'd used months ago to lead Daniel to his dying mother. Without questioning the insanity of following an escaped lion through the Spanish countryside at 3 in the morning, Daniel got in his truck. Courage jumped into the bed like a trained dog, pressing against the cab window as Daniel drove. They arrived to find the wildlife center in crisis. Hope had stopped breathing twice. Elena worked over the tiny cub with the focused desperation of someone refusing to accept another loss. Sophia hadn't moved in hours, her eyes fixed on her dying daughter with the terrible stillness of a mother watching inevitability approach. "She won't make it to morning," Elena said without looking up. "Her lungs are full of fluid. She's too small, too premature. I don't have the equipment." "What equipment?" Daniel interrupted. "Pediatric ventilator. The nearest one is in the Children's Hospital in Granada, but they won't release it for an animal." Daniel pulled out his phone and called James Mitchell. "I need your contacts. Now." What followed was a cascade of favors called in, connections exploited, rules bent to breaking. James knew someone who had treated the hospital administrator's daughter at a military base. That administrator owed a debt to a veterinary school that had saved his prize horses. The chain of obligation wound through midnight phone calls until, impossibly, permission was granted. Daniel drove to Granada while Elena kept hope alive through manual ventilation, squeezing a bag every few seconds to push air into failing lungs. Courage had returned to his enclosure voluntarily, now lying pressed against the bars closest to where his mother and sister struggled, making sounds none of them had heard before, not quite whines, not quite roars, but something that spoke of species' deep distress. The return drive from Granada took 90 minutes that felt like hours. Daniel broke every traffic law, the ventilator secured in his passenger seat like the most precious cargo he'd ever carried. He thought of another race against time, 5 years ago, following the ambulance that carried Michael, knowing even then it was too late but unable to stop hoping. He arrived to find a scene that would haunt him forever. Elena held Hope's tiny body, the cub's chest still, while Elena wept openly. Sophia hadn't moved, but tears, actual tears, ran from her eyes. Courage stood in his enclosure, rigid and silent, staring at his sister's still form with an expression that looked entirely too human. "She died 3 minutes ago," Elena whispered. "We were 3 minutes too late." Daniel set down the useless ventilator and entered Sophia's enclosure without asking permission. The lioness didn't react to his presence, lost in a grief that transcended species. He sat beside her, his hand on her shoulder, and began to speak. "My son died on a Tuesday," he said. his voice steady despite the tears. 3:27 in the afternoon. I remember because the hospital clock was broken. Stuck at noon, and I kept checking my watch, thinking if I tracked time carefully enough, I could make it stop, or reverse, or mean something other than what it meant. Sophia's eyes shifted slightly, acknowledging his presence. Margaret, my wife, she died on a Sunday, 7:42 in the morning. The sun was just coming up, and she said it looked like Michael was standing in the light, waiting for her. I wanted to see him too, but all I saw was empty light in a world that had taken everything I loved. He felt Sophia's breathing change, deepen, as if she were listening not to words but to the grief beneath them. I ran away, Daniel continued. Came here to hide from memories, from purpose, from the possibility of losing anything else. I thought if I loved nothing, nothing could hurt me. But your son found me anyway, led me to you. And now we're here, you and I, looking at another small body that should be alive, another future that won't happen, another piece of our hearts lying still when it should be moving. Sophia turned her massive head toward him, and for a moment, predator and prey, animal and human, looked at each other across the infinite distance and intimate closeness of shared loss. Then she did something that would be debated by animal behaviorists for years. She placed her paw gently on Daniel's hand. Not threatening, not possessive, but a gesture of contact that seemed to say, I see you. I recognize you. We are the same in this moment. They stayed that way while Elena prepared Hope's body for burial, while Courage maintained his rigid vigil, while the November night gave way to gray dawn. Father O'Brien arrived as the sun broke through clouds, finding Daniel still sitting with Sophia, her paw still resting on his hand. Daniel, the priest said softly, there's something you need to see. He handed Daniel an envelope, yellowed with age and bearing Margaret's handwriting. This was in the church archives. She left it with instructions to give it to you when you were ready. I think that might be now. Daniel opened the letter with trembling fingers, Sophia watching as if she understood the significance of paper and ink and human communication. My dearest Daniel, the letter began. If you're reading this, I'm gone and you're finally ready to hear what I couldn't make you understand while grief made us both deaf. Michael's death broke us. My death will break you again. But breaking isn't the same as ending. Sometimes things need to break to let light in. Before I got too sick to think clearly, I moved our savings, all of it, to an account in your name alone. It's more than you know. I was better at investing than I let on. And Michael's life insurance, well, we never touched it. It's all there. Waiting. The banker, Mr. Morrison at Santander, has the details. Michael dreamed of building a sanctuary. He told me about it during his last visit, showed me sketches and plans and budgets. He wanted to ask you to help design it, your engineering, his passion, building something together. He was working up the courage to ask when the accident happened. Build it, Daniel. Build it for him, for the animals he loved, for the man you could become if you let yourself. Use every penny. Make something permanent from all this impermanence. Let his dream outlive our grief. I'll be with Michael when you read this. We'll both be watching, waiting to see what you build from the ruins we left behind. All my love. Always. Margaret. The letter fluttered from Daniel's numb fingers. Sophia picked it up gently in her mouth, held it for a moment, then set it back in his lap, a gesture so deliberately careful that Father O'Brien crossed himself. How much? Daniel asked, his voice barely audible. Father O'Brien handed him a bank statement. The number made Daniel's vision blur, not just Margaret's savings and investments, but anonymous donations that had accumulated over 5 years. All marked for Michael's dream. 3 million euros. Enough to build something real. Enough to fight back. Daniel stood, his joints protesting after hours of sitting. He looked at Hope's small body, at Sophia's tear-stained face, at Courage maintaining his silent vigil. Then he looked at Elena, Father O'Brien, and James Mitchell, who'd arrived during the night. "We're not letting them take the lions," he said, his voice carrying the certainty of structural steel. "We're going to build Michael's sanctuary right here, and if the government wants to fight about it, they'll learn what happens when you corner a grieving father who has nothing left to lose and everything to build." Elena's eyes widened. "Daniel, the legal ramifications. I'm an engineer." Daniel interrupted. "I know how to build things that can't be torn down. We have 24 hours before the transport comes. James, call your contacts. Elena, get every conservation organization on the phone. Father, I need you to call the Vatican. Don't look surprised. I know you have connections. Sarah needs to live stream everything." He turned back to Sophia, who was watching him with those ancient amber eyes. "We're going to bury Hope at sunset," he told the lioness. "With dignity, with ceremony, with all the love she deserved in life. Then we're going to fight for you and courage. Not because we can win, but because that's what family does. We fight for each other, even when the odds are impossible." Sophia stood for the first time in hours, weak but determined. She walked to where Hope lay, lowered her massive head, and breathed on her daughter's still form a goodbye that transcended species. Then she looked at Daniel and made a sound he'd never heard from her before, low and resonant, almost like agreement. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist. In 24 hours, the government would come for the lions. But for now, in this moment between loss and battle, a strange family gathered around grief and found in it not an ending but a transformation. Hope was gone, but what she'd represented, the possibility of recovery, of continuity, of love that transcended logic, that lived on in the determination of those who remained. Daniel picked up Margaret's letter, folded it carefully, and placed it in his shirt pocket above his heart. Then he began making calls, engineering not a building but a rebellion built on love, loss, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and the wild things they're sometimes lucky enough to save. Sarah Bennett arrived at the Wildlife Center before dawn, her laptop containing files that would shatter everything they thought they knew. She'd spent the night following digital breadcrumbs through encrypted servers, using skills acquired during her years documenting wildlife crime. What she'd found made her physically sick. "The transport order isn't from the ministry," she announced to the gathered group, Daniel, Elena, James Mitchell, and Carlos Mendoza. "It's from Deputy Director Joaquin Herrera. He's been running the trafficking operation from inside the government. Every relocation of endangered species in the last 5 years has been a cover for black market sales." She turned her laptop screen toward them, showing shipping manifests with dual entries, official records showing animals transferred to legitimate facilities, shadow records showing the same animals sold to private collectors. Sophia's name appeared on both lists. "She was targeted specifically," Sarah continued, her voice tight with controlled rage. "Herrera knew about her Atlas genetics, knew she was pregnant. The poisoning wasn't random. They wanted her weak enough to capture but alive enough to birth valuable cubs. When that failed and Daniel found her, Herrera pivoted to legal seizure." Carlos Mendoza studied the documents with professional intensity. "This is evidence of systematic corruption, but we need more to stop tomorrow's transport. We need proof that connects directly to—" "Michael knew," James Mitchell interrupted, holding an external drive he'd pulled from his jacket. "Daniel, your son knew about Herrera. I've been investigating something else, and I found this in State Department intelligence files. Michael Harper filed a whistleblower report 3 weeks before his death." The room went silent. Daniel took the drive with trembling hands, plugging it into Sarah's laptop. Michael's files opened like a door to the past: photographs, documents, recorded conversations. His son had spent months documenting illegal wildlife transfers, tracking money through shell companies, identifying government officials who facilitated trafficking. The final file was dated 3 days before Michael's death. It was a video, shot on his phone in what looked like a parking garage. Michael's face filled the screen, young and serious and terrifyingly alive. "If something happens to me," Michael's recorded voice said, "investigate Joaquin Herrera. He threatened me yesterday, said construction accidents happen all the time. I'm uploading everything to multiple servers. Dad, if you're watching this, I'm sorry I never told you. I didn't want you to worry." but someone needs to know the truth. Daniel's legs gave out. James caught him, guided him to a chair while the video continued. Michael had recorded a meeting with Herrera, hidden phone capturing the deputy director offering him money to stop investigating, then threatening consequences when Michael refused. "Your father's an engineer," Herrera's voice said on the recording. "He understands structural failures. Sometimes cables snap. Sometimes people fall. Tragic accidents that nobody could prevent." The construction accident that killed Michael happened 4 days later. A cable that had passed inspection that morning suddenly failed. No witnesses. No investigation beyond standard procedures. No reason to suspect anything but terrible luck. "He was murdered," Daniel said, his voice hollow. "My son was murdered for trying to protect animals like Sofia." Carlos Mendoza was already on his phone, calling prosecutors, judges, anyone with authority to act on this evidence. Sarah uploaded everything to secure servers while simultaneously preparing a media package that would make suppression impossible. James Mitchell made 3 calls to contacts in Madrid, Washington, and Brussels. Within 2 hours, the Wildlife Center was surrounded by law enforcement vehicles not to remove the lions but to protect them. Joaquin Herrera was arrested at his home, pulled from his bed in front of news cameras Sarah had tipped off. The transport order was suspended pending investigation. The morning that should have brought separation brought vindication instead, but the revelations kept coming. Investigators found Herrera's complete records, detailed documentation of 5 years of trafficking. Michael's name appeared repeatedly not just as an investigator, but as a specific target. Herrera had arranged Michael's placement at the construction site, had ensured he'd be working alone that day, had personally inspected the cable that would fail. "Your son was a hero," the lead prosecutor told Daniel that afternoon. "His documentation will take down the entire network. Dozens of animals will be recovered. The people responsible will spend their lives in prison." Daniel heard the words but couldn't process them. Michael hadn't died randomly. He'd died defending creatures like Sofia, had been murdered for refusing to accept corruption. The grief Daniel had carried for 5 years transformed into something else not lighter but different, shaped now by pride alongside sorrow. The international response was immediate and overwhelming. Conservation organizations that had ignored the small Spanish center now offered unlimited support. The European Union announced emergency funding for wildlife trafficking prevention. The Atlas Lion Project dedicated their entire breeding program to Michael's memory. Judge Patricia Vega, known for her environmental activism, fast-tracked the legal proceedings. Within a week, she issued a ruling that would become precedent. Not only could Sofia and Courage remain at the center, but Daniel would be licensed as a special rehabilitation coordinator. His lack of formal training was overruled by what the judge called demonstrated extraordinary capability in wildlife crisis intervention. Additionally, Judge Vega announced, reading from her decision, "The court orders the immediate allocation of seized trafficking assets, approximately €12 million, to establish the Michael Harper Wildlife Sanctuary at this location." The courtroom erupted. Daniel sat stunned while Elena hugged him. Father O'Brien blessed them both, and Sarah documented the moment that changed everything. Outside, the small Spanish town celebrated with impromptu festivities that lasted until dawn. But the most profound change happened quietly, away from cameras and celebrations. Sofia, who'd barely moved since Hope's death, began eating again. Not much at first, but consistently. Courage, who'd maintained his silent vigil, started showing behaviors Elena had never seen, organizing enrichment toys, marking territory boundaries, displaying the leadership traits of a pride male despite his youth. "He's preparing," Elena observed, watching Courage arrange bones in specific patterns. "It's like he knows something's changing, that he needs to be ready for responsibility." Daniel found Michael's sanctuary plans hidden in a safety deposit box Margaret had mentioned in her letter. His son had drawn detailed blueprints, enclosures that balanced freedom with safety, medical facilities disguised as natural features, observation posts that allowed monitoring without intrusion. The drawings bore notes in Michael's handwriting and, surprisingly, suggestions in Margaret's. She helped him plan it, Daniel realized, tracing his wife's additions with trembling fingers, She knew about his investigation. She supported it. That's why she saved so aggressively, not for retirement, but for this. The money Margaret had accumulated, combined with the seized assets and international donations, totaled nearly 20 million euros, enough to build not just a sanctuary but a research center, an education facility, a blueprint for conservation that could be replicated worldwide. James Mitchell revealed his own secret, that he hadn't randomly retired to Spain. The State Department had placed him there to monitor trafficking routes. "I was watching Herrera for 3 years," he admitted, "but I never connected him to Michael's death. I'm sorry, Daniel. I should have seen it sooner." "You see it now," Daniel replied. "That's what matters." Construction began immediately, with Daniel overseeing every detail. He modified Michael's plans with engineering insights, creating structures that would last centuries. The main hospital, built around natural rock formations, could weather any storm. The enclosures, vast enough for lions to run, included hidden medical stations for emergency interventions. Father O'Brien conducted a blessing ceremony that drew hundreds. He spoke about redemption through truth, about justice that arrives late but arrives nonetheless, about dreams that outlive dreamers. Then he did something unexpected. He asked Sophia and Courage to be present for the blessing. Elena supervised their transport to the construction site, where they watched from a temporary enclosure as Father O'Brien blessed the ground where Michael's dream would rise. Sophia stood throughout the ceremony, her strength returning daily. When the priest finished, she roared the first time since her poisoning, a sound that echoed across the valley like a proclamation. Courage joined his mother's roar with his own developing voice, not yet mature but carrying unmistakable authority. The gathered crowd stood silent, witnessing something that transcended religious or cultural boundaries, the voice of the wild blessing its own sanctuary. That evening, Daniel sat with the lions as sunset painted the construction site gold. Sophia rested her massive head near the fence where he sat, while Courage groomed himself with new dignity. They were no longer victims requiring rescue, but survivors preparing for whatever came next. "Michael would be proud," Elena said, joining Daniel. "He is proud," Daniel corrected. "Wherever he is, he sees this. His work continues. His murder meant to silence him only amplified his voice." The truth that had been revealed wasn't just about corruption or trafficking. It was about the power of documentation, the importance of witnessing, the courage required to stand against systems that profit from suffering. Michael had died for that truth, but in dying had ensured its revelation. Tomorrow, construction would continue. The sanctuary would rise. Sophia would grow stronger. Courage would mature into his name, and Daniel would build something permanent from loss, something that would outlive them all, a testament to the bonds between species, the price of truth, and the possibility of justice, even when it comes too late to save the ones we love. 6 months had transformed the landscape, where scrubland and abandoned farmland once sprawled. The Michael Harper Wildlife Sanctuary now stretched across 300 hectares of carefully designed habitat. Daniel stood on the observation platform he'd engineered himself, watching Sophia and Courage explore their new territory, not quite wild, but no longer captive, existing in the careful balance between protection and freedom. The morning of the release ceremony dawned clear and warm, unusual for March in the Sierra Morena. 500 people had gathered, locals who'd watched the transformation, international conservation leaders who'd flown in for the occasion, journalists who'd followed the story from its desperate beginning. But Daniel saw none of them. His attention fixed entirely on Sophia, who stood at the gate between her medical enclosure and the vast space beyond. She'd recovered completely, her coat glossy, her muscles restored. More remarkably, she'd developed a calm confidence that hadn't existed before her ordeal. The terrified, poisoned creature Daniel had found 8 months ago had evolved into something magnificent, not just physically, but in the way she carried herself. Aware of her survival against impossible odds, courage had grown into his name. At 14 months old, he showed the beginning of a mane, dark tufts that would eventually frame his face in glory. But it was his bearing that commanded attention, protective without aggression, alert without anxiety. He'd appointed himself guardian of the sanctuary's other rescues, 2 leopards recovered from a circus. an elderly tiger saved from a roadside zoo. He didn't interact with them directly, but monitored their well-being with serious attention. Elena took the podium first, speaking about the medical miracles she'd witnessed. Sophia died for 25 minutes, she reminded the crowd. By every measure of veterinary science, she shouldn't be standing here. But she fought back for her cubs, for her son, for reasons that transcend our understanding of animal behavior. James Mitchell spoke next, carefully avoiding classified details while explaining how Michael's documentation had dismantled a trafficking network spanning 3 continents. 47 animals have been recovered because of his work. 16 people are serving prison sentences. The commerce in endangered species through Spain has dropped by 90%. Father O'Brien offered a blessing that wove together threads from multiple traditions: Christian mercy, Buddhist compassion, indigenous respect for the natural world. "We gather not to celebrate human dominion over nature," he said, "but to acknowledge our place within it, our responsibilities to it, and our capacity for redemption when we fail those responsibilities." Sarah Bennett didn't speak, but moved through the crowd with her camera, documenting faces and moments. Her book about the rescue would win international awards, but more importantly, it would inspire similar sanctuaries in Morocco, Portugal, and southern France. Then it was Daniel's turn. He'd prepared remarks but abandoned them, speaking instead from his heart. "My son Michael believed that saving one life matters, even when we can't save them all. He died defending that belief, murdered for refusing to accept that profit matters more than preservation. I came to Spain to escape the pain of losing him, only to discover that he'd been here all along in Sophia, whom he'd saved as a cub, in the plans he'd drawn for this sanctuary, in the values he'd lived and died for." He paused, looking directly at Sophia, who watched him with those amber eyes that had seen so much. "Today, we don't release these lions to the wild. That world no longer exists for them. Instead, we offer them something perhaps more precious: protected space to be themselves, to raise future generations, to remind us that wildness isn't about geography, but about spirit. Sophia and courage have taught me that grief and grace can coexist, that broken things can be rebuilt stronger, that love transcends species and time and even death." Daniel stepped down from the podium and walked to the release gate. Sophia moved forward, courage beside her. For a moment, all 3 stood at the threshold, man and lions, separated by wire but united by journey. "Thank you," Daniel whispered, words meant only for them. "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for continuing Michael's work in ways he never imagined." He pulled the release lever. The gate swung open slowly, revealing hundreds of acres of Mediterranean forest, grassland, and rocky outcroppings. Sophia stepped through first, her movement deliberate and dignified. She walked 20 yards, then stopped, surveying her new territory with the assessment of a queen examining her realm. Courage hesitated at the threshold, looking back at Daniel. In that gaze was a question and an answer, a farewell and a promise. Then he followed his mother, breaking into a run that showed his youth and strength, circling back to her with obvious joy. They didn't go far that first day, exploring the immediate area, marking boundaries, claiming space. But as weeks passed, they ventured deeper into the sanctuary, discovering the hidden water sources Daniel had engineered, the sheltered valleys perfect for denning, the high rocks that caught the morning sun. 1 year later, Daniel stood at the same observation platform, now weathered by seasons but solid as the day he'd built it. The sanctuary had expanded: more rescues, more releases, more lives transformed. But his attention focused on a specific movement in the valley below. Courage appeared first, fully maned now, magnificent in his prime. Behind him came something that made Daniel's breath catch: a female lion, young and healthy, recently relocated from a failed zoo in Eastern Europe. And behind her, stumbling on legs too new for grace, came 2 cubs. Courage had become a father. The small family approached the fence line that separated the sanctuary from the developed areas. It was the closest Courage had come to the human zones in months, and Daniel understood immediately this was an introduction. Courage sat at the fence, his family arranging themselves beside him. The cubs, perhaps 8 weeks old, tumbled over each other with the uncoordinated enthusiasm of all young things. Their mother watched with the patience of mothers everywhere. And Courage looked directly at Daniel with an expression that needed no translation. "These are mine. I protect them as you protected us." Sophia emerged from the tree line. Older now, but still strong, she'd adapted to her role as matriarch, teaching the younger rescues through example rather than interaction. She approached her son's family, inspected the cubs with grandmotherly attention, then turned her gaze to Daniel. In that look was everything acknowledgement of their shared journey, recognition of survival against odds, understanding that some bonds transcend the divisions between species. She'd lost 2 cubs but gained a legacy. Daniel had lost his son but found a purpose. The sanctuary Michael had dreamed of now sheltered not just lions but the connections between all living things. "Michael, do you see this?" Daniel whispered to the wind. "Your Sophia is a grandmother. Courage is a father. The sanctuary hosts 15 rescued cats, 20 staff members, and 300 students who visit each month to learn about conservation. Your dream didn't just survive, it's thriving." The sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the landscape in shades of gold that turned Courage's mane into flame. The cubs played while their parents watched, while Sophia rested in dignified repose, while Daniel witnessed the continuation of everything they'd fought to preserve. Carlos Mendoza arrived with the evening report: 0 poaching incidents for 6 consecutive months. Legislation passed based on the sanctuary's model. 3 more facilities under construction using Daniel's blueprints. The ripples of Michael's work, amplified by tragedy and transformed through justice, continued spreading. As darkness approached, the lion family moved back into the sanctuary's depths. But not before Courage paused at the territory's edge. He looked back at Daniel and roared not a challenge or warning, but a statement of presence, of continuity, of wild things enduring despite humanity's failures and because of its rare graces. Daniel remained on the platform until stars emerged, thinking about circles completing and new ones beginning. Below him, the sanctuary breathed with life, predators and prey in careful balance, wildness preserved within necessary boundaries, dreams made concrete through engineering and love. Tomorrow, more rescues would arrive. The sanctuary would grow. Courage's cubs would learn to hunt. Sophia would continue her quiet reign, and Daniel would be here, building and maintaining and witnessing, honoring his son's legacy in the most profound way possible by ensuring it continued. The wind carried the sound of lions calling to each other across the darkness, voices that had nearly been silenced forever now singing their ancient songs. Daniel closed his eyes and listened, hearing in those calls not just survival but triumph, not just wildness but connection, not just endings but beginnings that Michael would have loved. In saving Sophia, they'd saved themselves. In losing those they loved, they'd found reasons to continue. In the space between human and wild, they'd discovered that love transcends species, that purpose can emerge from pain, and that sometimes the universe arranges impossible meetings to heal wounds we didn't know could heal. The circle of life continued, written now in sanctuary boundaries and lion roars, in an old man's dedication and young cubs' play, in the space where grief became grace and loss became legacy. Michael Harper had saved a lion cub 6 years ago, never knowing that act would ripple forward to save his father, create a sanctuary, and prove that some things love, purpose, wild beauty truly endure. I need to tell you something about gratitude that I learned from watching a lion place her paw on a grieving man's hand. We think gratitude is a human invention, something we practice at dinner tables and write in journals. But I've seen it in amber eyes that watched a stranger save her cubs. I've felt it in the weight of a young lion leaning against fence wire, acknowledging debts that can't be spoken. Family isn't blood or species or even choice. It's what happens when broken things recognize each other and decide to heal together. Daniel didn't just save lions, they saved him right back. That reciprocal rescue, that mutual recognition of loss and the decision to continue anyway. That's what family really is. The miracle isn't that Sophia's heart restarted when her cubs were placed on her chest. The miracle is that love works exactly the same way across every beating heart on this planet. We're all walking around with invisible wounds, looking for someone who understands the particular shape of our grief. Sometimes that someone has 4 legs and ancient eyes. Sometimes salvation comes from the thing you'd least expect. But it always requires the courage to remain grateful, even when gratitude seems impossible. That's what Michael knew. That's what his lions taught his father. That's what I'm trying to tell you now.